Hello, everyone. So, for the first video of the new year, I figure I'd do a vlog-style review of a book which normally I would review in August as part of my Gen Con tabletop role-playing game review thing. I think I'm going to do some other stuff there, though, this coming year. Specifically, I'm going to give my thoughts on the quadrilogy. Isn't actually a word, but it is the term that is used in the common parlance. So that's what I'll use here. Quadrilogy of Designers and Dragons Histories by Shannon Appelcline. So this book originally started, or series of books, really started as one single kind of tome of a volume just called Designer and Dragons, hardbound, nice silver leaf embossing on the cover. And later on, this was published by, I want to say Mongoose, but got reprinted later by Evil Hat Productions in a nice 4-book set divided up by decade and expanded considerably. And that is the version that's currently available now. And that's what I read. It's available both print and audiobook form, which is interesting. We're starting to get, as we're getting more books about the history of tabletop role-playing games, we're also starting to get a lot of these as audiobooks. So I've had a chance to listen to those as audiobooks as well, in addition to reading them in print. So, basically, these series of books is divided up by decade by when the companies covered in them started. And each history covers the history of the relevant company, more or less from beginning to relative end, sort of. We'll get to the sort of in a second. So, for example, TSR's history starts in the 90s, goes until the bankruptcy and the buyout by Wizards of the Coast, stops there. And if you want to know the rest of that story of what happened to TSR after the Wizards of the Coast buyout, you have to move on to Designers and Dragons the 90s to pick up and see what happened there. History of our Talzorian games, or FASA, starts in Designer and Dragons the 80s, and then for FASA, that goes there, ends, and if you want to learn more about what happens after FASA ceases operations, you have to go into Designer and Dragons the aughts to learn about Fan Pro and Catalyst Game Labs, that sort of thing. And generally, the structure works very well, because it helps build this sense of interlinking narrative between these individual books, expedited or assisted by the fact that at the end of each individual history, Appelcline gives recommended readings on other books or on other histories to pick up afterwards. If you're, rather than just going from cover to cover, you want to follow particular narratives. So, as an example, once you finish the history of TSR, the recommended history will include Wizards of the Coast, but it will also include, say, Mayfair Games, or Game Designers Workshop, because Mayfair Games did the Roll Aids titles, which had an extended legal, led to Mayfair having extended legal battle with TSR, or TSR sued Game Designers Workshop over the decision by Game Designers Workshop to publish Gary Gygax's Legendary Adventures games. And so to learn more about the rest of that company and its history, it directs you to there as far as what happened leading up to that court case. Or the Judges Guild to learn the history of that company and its involvement with some of the creating some of the earliest third-party Dungeons & Dragons titles. Not the first. You go to We Warriors for that, which you also have a history of that there as well in Designers & Dragons the 70s. That sort of thing. So it gives you a really good way to, like, here's this history, how all these companies interrelate to each other and branch out and that sort of thing. I would describe this as being somewhat encyclopedic. I don't just mean this in the sense of, like, in the ways that an encyclopedia is not 100% comprehensive. It doesn't give you everything, but it gives you a lot to build off of. It gives you a really good, solid overview, and depending on the encyclopedia, may also give some recommended readings or additional places to go to learn more information. Now, this isn't 100% comprehensive in this regard. Like, we do get like quotes from particular sources and referencing of those sources, like articles and reviews in Space Gamer magazine, or Polyhedron, or Dragon, or White Wolf magazine, or that sort of thing, or Red Dwarf. Yes, Red Dwarf. Yes, Red Dwarf. But the White Dwarf. White Dwarf was the Games Workshop magazine. Well, it still is, sort of. But on the other hand, like, not to put too fine a point on it, game publishers have been really crappy about preserving large portions of their history and making them available. Some of this is due to circumstances beyond their control. Now, the classic example being the Dragon Magazine Archive CD set, which had PDF versions of almost every issue of Dragon Magazine, pretty much every issue of Dragon Magazine to date as when that came out. Comprehensive, including comics and advertisements, with the issue being, of course, they didn't get the reprint rights for a bunch of that stuff, in particular the comics, so that led to problems and the Dragon Magazine Archive getting a limited print run. You can still find those Dragon Magazine issues in some places on the internet. Not legal places, but they're there. But in the process, you're missing a bit of history there. So you're not going to get to, so there isn't an easy legal way to go, for example, see when the creator of Call of Cthulhu, whose name's literally just dropped out of my brain. I hate when this happens. Sandy Peterson. There we go. Sandy Peterson. If you can, you can go to a bootleg PDF or an illegal PDF, pirated PDF, and find Sandy Peterson's reviews from Dragon Magazine that way. But you're not going to be able to legally access those reviews. Same for Space Gamer. Same for old issues of White Dwarf. So if you want to read, or even for that matter, a lot of the Pyramid Magazine archives, particularly for stuff that's related to third-party RPGs that weren't originally published by Steve Jackson Games. So if you want to find Shadowrun articles that were published in Pyramid Magazine, good luck with that. You're going to need to find a bootleg version because the legal versions aren't available. That's how it is. And that is, to a certain degree, frustrating. But that's not Shannon Applecline's fault. He does a good job of citing his sources for quotes and that sort of thing, so that if you're willing to do the legwork to find these other sources, by hook or, in often cases, by crook, you're gonna you have a place to start from. Additionally, there are some gaps in knowledge related to knowledge of role-playing games from outside of the United States. We get hints at some coverage of the role-playing game industry in Sweden when we get to a sidebar article about Target Games and discussion of some of the titles that they've brought in. Or not all of them, but we do get discussion like Drakar i Demoner, which is based off of the Runecrest rules and that sort of thing, as a lead up into what does get brought over, which is stuff like, I want to say, another game name just fell out of my head, the Angels and Demons role-playing game that Steve Jackson Games published for a while, around the same time that World of Darkness was really big. In any case, but there's that. We get some coverage, like a brief mention of Die Schwarze Auge and the German role-playing game scene, but not a lot, so we don't get as much discussion of, like, by contrast, like how, like when we talk about FanPro, we talk about that when FASA was closing, stopping their RPG publication, and people were looking for partners to pick up these product lines, successful product lines like BattleTech and Shadowrun. That this basically the German company was willing to come in and help pick up these lines because they had been very successful publishing Shadowrun and BattleTech in Germany, and wanted to keep supporting those lines and cover the U.S. side of things, leading to the American FanPro LLC, which then closed when the German branch got into financial troubles, leading ultimately to that getting spun into Catalyst Game Labs. All this covered in Designers and Dragons of the Aughts. What we don't get discussion of what was going on in Germany, which is a bummer, because one of the things that FanPro US did was it tried to do like one of the earliest US versions of Das Schwarze Auge as the Dark Eye, which you may have seen in a lot of on the top of the title logos of a lot of Eurojank CRPGs in the Steam store and elsewhere. But we discussed that they imported the game. It didn't really take off in the US, but we don't talk about what the game is, how it works, and why it was big in Europe. There are some missed opportunities there. When we talk, same thing in the aughts, there's discussion of The Forge, and Indie Press Revolution, where we get with the rise of PDF publishing and print-on-demand publishing, this opportunity for independent game publishers to start putting out their own games. Well before you start having indie game designers putting out their tabletop RPG concepts on itch.io, because itch doesn't exist yet. And one of the things that start popping up through The Forge was you also start seeing like the earliest licensed Japanese tabletop role-playing games, like Made, because Made fits into some of the spaces in terms of game design that are popular on The Forge, in terms of the types of free-form, somewhat narrativist gameplay concepts. And we get when I first saw Made become available, as one of the first Japanese tabletop role-playing games get US release, well before Ryutama, that was being sold through IPR. But we don't get there isn't this they don't get the opportunity here to talk about the rise and the propagation of translated Japanese tabletop role-playing games in the United States, or in turn how that scene works in general. I would hope in future iterations, because we don't have Designers and Dragons at 10s yet, we get an opportunity to explore this, but this is where we are. This also leads one of the other minor major issues, depending on how you consider it and how comprehensive you want your books to be, is that in terms of when this book was published and the history research, the research that was done for developing it, it kind of stops in the mid-2010s. In particular, at a point in the mid-2010s, basically right before D&D 5th edition came out, and we're in the place tasting stage, and it's still called D&D Next. Or Wizards has decided, okay, now we're calling it D&D 5th edition. And as part of this means that we don't know that we, in the sense of, if you're going by what's in the book, and we as in the industry don't know, at the time the books were published, don't know how 5th edition is going to turn out. We know that 4th edition did badly and kind of tanked, and this is very much potentially a Hail Mary play by Wizards. If this doesn't work, what does Hasbro do with Dungeons and Dragons? Do they consider it a dead brand? Do they shelve it and stick it in the vault? And it's up to Pathfinder to carry the torch. That was a legitimate concern at the time as we were approaching the release of 5th edition. This also means at this time we are before the rise of the actual play podcast. Critical Role hasn't started yet. I think Critical Role hasn't started. Maybe we've gotten some Acquisitions Incorporated stuff with Penny Arcade and 4th edition, we might have gotten some 3rd edition stuff with Loading Ready Run and Temple of the Lava Bears as a Kickstarter thing. But you haven't gotten the juggernaut that Critical Role almost was from the jump. So, and with what came from that. So, like, there were actual play podcast, other just regular actual play podcasts at this time. I was listening to the RPG MP3 podcasts at this point. They'd done stuff like the World's Largest Dungeon podcast, that sort of thing. Actual play was also a thing on the Forge, where people were talking about and giving their play experiences with these indie titles. But it wasn't as essential a thing in the larger role-playing game cultural conversation, and certainly not mainstream, and the way that it is now. I mean, hell, podcasts weren't particularly mainstream then either. So with that in mind, like, that makes for a landscape of what role-playing looked like in the 90s, like in the 90s, but like in the mid-10s. It feels very different than where we are now, almost a decade later. And that's reflected in the work, where, and additionally, and I hope that this is something that Apple Klein, whenever he does Designers and Dragons and Tens, is able to get into, is discussion of like what's happened in the past 10 years since this last book came out. Because some of these companies have fallen, or completely reformed. Like Moon Design has been folded into Chaosium, with then at the time Greg Stafford being the head of the company, to handle new editions of RuneQuest and new publications or republications of RuneQuest and Glorantha material, and then for Greg Stafford to sadly pass away. We've also had something of Me Too reckoning in the tabletop role-playing game design space, not just in terms of sexual assault and harassment, but also in terms of just harassment and abuse in general. Bill Webb of Frog God Games has basically been outed as a barely functional alcoholic who tends to have a problem at gaming conventions of drinking to significant excess and being abusive and handsy with people. The tabletop role-playing game designer named John Wick, as opposed to the fictional character played by Keanu Reeves, John Wick, the game designer John Wick has been outed as being an abusive person, not just at the role-playing table, something which he kind of outed himself somewhat as in his Play Dirty columns, but also in the workplace as being a toxic person. The designer of Burning Wheel ended up using his position as head of the role-playing game promotion division of Kickstarter to promote his own projects in ways that, being able to do things that other people using Kickstarter were not able to do, and ultimately was forced to resign. Stuff like name changes, but also partnering with people who were known abusers and who were skeezy, and not disclosing that to other people who were signed up to the project, to leading to situations where the project get announced and designer A going, wait, I'm working on the project with designer B, who has been outed as for being for on a live stream refusing to acknowledge an X card for sexual assault content and forcing a player to role play out a scene of sexual assault. That's gross. I don't want to work on this project with this person now. And if I had known in the first place, I wouldn't have taken the job at all. That happened. On the lighter note, we've also had like a major, like the book discusses the rise of Apocalypse World and the rise of Powered by the Apocalypse games, but it came out before the big, well, it's a branch off of that of Blades in the Dark, and with that, the Forged in the Dark family of games, which arguably has become even bigger, to the point that when in 2023, when when the whole OGL mess happened with Wizards of the Coast, we had a lot of people saying, "Hey, why don't you try out?" Like when people say, "Hey, I think I'd like to play something else," the overwhelming response from a lot of people was, "Oh, play Forged in the Dark games instead." Um, I've already done a video on why that's not necessarily a perfect blanket recommendation, but the point stands. Like, there was enough of a big family of Forged in the Dark games where there are people like, "Oh, we're willing to do a blanket recommendation of play games that are Forged in the Dark. You will eventually find one that is right for you, or that does what you want it to, or there's enough resources there to help you adjust a game or a game system into exactly what you want." Which somewhat skeptical, if well, not skeptical, but a little iffy on that. But again, that's a topic for another video that is already out and on the channel. Uh, in any case, but like still, like this makes for like, a really good way to learn about the history of role playing games, the larger structure of role playing game history from beginning to not the present, but a little bit in the past. 10 years in the past. A lot has changed since these books came out, but there's still plenty of history there and a lot to learn from this history. There's a lot of things people were saying about the OGL and how we didn't need it when Wizards announced that they were revoking it. That it's kind of thing like, if you, as I mentioned in my video that I did about the OGL at the time, that, well, if you read, not to say, oh, you need to read this book before you talk about role-playing games, but this book provides a lot of historical background to explain why the OGL was necessary and why people were still willing to stick with it, not because the OGL provided a degree of trust and that a degree of confidence that you could make your game based off Dungeons and Dragons, or compatible with Dungeons and Dragons, or compatible with a game that was inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, without having to worry about facing litigation in the way that TSR would have done it in the past, or the way that Palladium Books had done it in the past, or that sort of thing. That you had a confidence that you would not have had before, and it's not like that. Yes, you could have won in court about about being able to make a compatible game over using existing court precedent and that sort of thing, about game rules not being patentable. But that's still an expensive court case, and as we learn over the course of these 4 volumes, with the various companies that TSR fought and lost to TSR, not because they were in the wrong, but because TSR could fight them for longer, that situation is less likely to happen when you have the OGL to go off. In any case, these books are really engaging, really riveting, and I would also say it's probably going to introduce you to some other role-playing games that you had never heard of. Whether it's Original Traveler, whether it's Mercenaries, Spies, and Private Eyes, whether it's Villains and Vigilantes, whether it's FASA's Star Trek role-playing game, or any other number of titles that you had not heard of before. The Heavy Gear role-playing game, Blue Planet, you name it. There is something here that you like. There is a game here that you have not heard of, a company whose work you've never heard of, designers who you've never heard of, but who has inspired other creators, or drew inspiration from works that you liked, and may inspire you to go hunt down a copy of that game, maybe off of eBay, maybe as a PDF, who knows. In any case, I think these books are absolutely worth your time. I will have a link in the doobly-doo as to where you can get them, be they print, digital, or audiobook. And I hope that you have the opportunity to read these books and enjoy them. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe. And also consider backing my Patreon. Patreon backers get episodes up to 1 week early of this show and any future Let's Plays. Also, please consider backing my Ko-fi. Toss me a few bucks, also helps support the show, and it's not a monthly obligation or anything like that.